one of our South Asia Institute colloquia at Columbia University. I would like to remind people that last year we began the normal scheduling of the colloquia is Mondays at this time at 4:15. Last year with COVID, we also began scheduling some things on Friday mornings at 10 a.m. So that people in South Asia could actually participate at a reasonable time of day for them. And I do want to mention that we're having a part of a series that we did last year is continuing with a masterclass this Friday with Gayatri Spivak at 10 a.m. So I just wanted to mention that one. And today I am delighted to be able to welcome Sumit Guha for today's colloquium. He will be speaking on languages of empire in South Asia, a sociolinguistic study, 1500 to 1900. I should also mention, I guess I forgot to introduce myself. I'm Kathy Ewing, directing the Institute. You can kind of hear that I'm a little rusty after a long summer away and this sort of transition to Zoom. So I'll just say a little bit about Professor Guha before he begins. He was born in New Delhi, received his MA from JNU Delhi before completing a PhD in history at the University of Cambridge. He taught at St. Stephen's College in Delhi and the Indian Institute of Management in Calcutta before moving to Brown University in 2000. He also taught at Rutgers and is currently the Francis Higginbotham Nolly Centennial Professor in History at the University of Texas at Austin. He's written numerous books, including the 2000, I'll just mention a couple of the most recent ones, the 2019 book, History and Collective Memory in South Asia, 1200 to 2000, delineates the historiographic legacy acquired by the British in colonial India, looking at the creation of the centralized educational system and mass production of textbooks that led to unification of historical discourses under colonial auspices, and the divergence of these discourses in the 20th century under the impact of nationalism and decolonization. He has a new book, Tribe and State in Asia Through 25 Centuries. This is 2021, so I guess it's just come out, which explores the concept of tribe. It analyzes the Asian use of tribe-like categories, European deployment of the term in the age of imperialism, and the environments where it flourishes, and those that and how the diversity of tribes across Asia today is represented. He's currently working on a study of the political ecology of empires in South Asia from 1400 to 1900. So wide-ranging, and I'm really eager to hear your discussion today of languages of empire. So please join me in welcoming Professor Sumit Guha. A little different when everybody's silenced, but please go ahead.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Kathy, for that generous introduction, and thank you all for making the time to tune into this talk and overcoming sorry, is that my, I hope that's not my sound, but anyway, overcoming any technical.
Yeah, I don't know why we're getting that feedback. Everybody else who's not speaking, please mute your mics. I have Karen Dobruski, who's showing up on my screen. Thank you. Okay, maybe try to go. Are you?
I'm now sharing my screen. I hope it's visible to everyone.
Yeah.
Okay, well, as I said, thank you all for attending this talk. And it's actually grown a little larger, if shallower, in the period between my sending in the title and between today. And so I'm actually now covering something of the order of 2,000 years. And I'll be comparing different empires all broadly in the western half of Eurasia, but for much of which I am putting together different ideas from various secondary sources, but I hope that I'm putting them together in a frame that may be novel to at least some of you. Okay, with that hope, let me get started. I have quite a lot of ground to cover, as you can imagine. So I'm going to introduce firstly some important ideas from sociolinguistics which relate to the history of language or the study of the history of language. Then I'm going to use these to analyze the working of imperial languages in Western Eurasia, which is to say broadly, Asia west of the Gobi Desert, Eurasia west of the Gobi Desert, in terms of two levels. One is the court-centered imperial project, of which there have been a whole succession certainly from the empires of the Iron Age, approximately 500 BCE, with which I shall begin. And secondly, below the imperial project, the office-centered clerical enterprises that nested within it and sought to control it or turn it to their own advantage. So the first part is just going to introduce a few concepts from the linguistic sciences which are relevant to historical language change. And to begin with, I should say that it therefore rejects the philological focus on great texts, which is not to say that philology is not a valuable discipline or not an important one, but this is not going to be a philological exercise. Okay, the first concept that I want to introduce, because it's going to recur throughout this talk, is Creolization, which is to say the formation of this. Anyway, it will be defined a little in the sort of next slide or so. But Creolization is something most of us should understand, because I think many of us have struggled to learn foreign languages and archaic scripts, to figure out scribal conventions, literary tropes, and the whole world that they reflect. And these struggles of our own, our individual ones, should lead us to reflect on the difficulty of sustaining the study of a foreign language in pre-modern settings, one in which almost all communication was oral. So, to be concrete, children would have to commit years to the study of a language that none of their usual caregivers would have spoken. Then they would have to progress to learning scripts also unknown to most of those around them. These are both quite daunting challenges, and pretty much, a very large fraction of the children that I speak of would, of course, be little boys. And furthermore, insofar as the power elite and empires are obviously structured around power elites, insofar as the power elite used a foreign, quote, language, their many subalterns would have to communicate them in a pidgin, which again, has negative connotations in colloquial discourse, but actually has a very distinct definition in linguistics and in language contact studies. They would communicate them with a pidgin, which could become a Creole or vernacular, which of course derives from the Latin vernacular, which was a kind of crude Latinate dialect spoken, originally attributed to slaves who were born within the household. So who were not therefore properly educated in Latin, but nonetheless were exposed to it being spoken around them by their masters. contact pigeons in stable situations quickly develop into, well, not quickly, but soon develop into creoles. And creoles can be defined, or are defined, as languages in which the superstrate language supplies much of the lexicon and the substrate most of the grammar. And major studies of creoles have, of course, taken up the creoles of the Caribbean, of which Haitian Creole is a prominent example, but also many others which were generated by European empires, particularly the Spanish and the Portuguese, and particularly the Portuguese across the Indian Ocean and Pacific. A general tendency is that the widespread use of a Creole tends to replace the superstrate language in the circumstances that I've already described, in which the superstrate, the high language, is one which is spoken by a small elite and an elite that is surrounded and has its children brought up by numerous caregivers, dependents, and so forth, who don't in fact speak the high language. That's why, that's why they're dependents or slaves or whatever else. Secondly, the tendency to replace the superstrate language will prevail unless institutional forces intervene to support it. Literacy, which fixes language in a certain way, is one of these institutional forces. But writing was an important technology of empire. And since skills were learned by apprenticeship, usually learned, I should say, by apprenticeship with an established practitioner, there were no language tapes, CDs, or online classes in that period, needless to say. The interruption of 2 or 3 generations could result in the irrevocable loss of skills and scripts. So this is not something which was always permanently assured. But where literacy and an imperial language prevailed, there was a certain stabilization of the high language, the superstrate language. Further, geography also constrained access. Okay, I'm here, probably about 1,500 miles away from Colombia, but present virtually. This was obviously not possible earlier. And the tyranny of distance is magnified when travel is dangerous, which is often a phase of the decline of empires. So, venturing even 50 miles from home might be a hazardous enterprise and one that people did not lightly embark upon. I have a slight error in the header of this slide, but the question that it tries to address is one of the forces, apart from literacy and the use of literacy for imperial purposes, another force that resists creolization is language ideology. Now, language ideology, again, to emphasize, is not a negative characterization. It's a neutral descriptor in sociolinguistics. In fact, there are people who specialize in language ideologies. There have been specialized volumes putting these together. So one of the forces that lies against, that moves against the assimilation of the high language to a substrate language or the process of creolization is that imperial processes were often inflected with language ideologies and bureaucratic interests. So the linguistics uses the concept of language ideology to define a particular field of study, one that examines strongly held beliefs about language. And Anglophilia, Francophilia, Persophilia, or whatever else you like, philia, are forms of language ideology. Some languages also have the additional characteristic of being sacred languages. And for the purposes of this talk, I'm going to classify religion as an ideology. So, and it's historically is one of the most important ideologies in world history, not least in the state of Texas, where I live. Okay, these are a few examples, obviously from a very large number that could be made, but every self-conscious linguistic community has an ideology. Self-conscious means one that is conscious of speaking a particular language, which is almost always the result of a contact situation. You only realize that you're speaking a particular language when you are in touch with people who don't. And so you get a bunch of these, the Arabs, after the conquest of Iran, labeled the Persians ajam or stutterer. The Parthian and Sasanian rulers, after the destruction of the Hellenic empires in West Asia and the Iranian world, used spoken Middle Persian but wrote in Aramaic. And this is something that I'll return to later. And priestly classes often maintained a sacred language. These are phenomena with which I think everyone is largely familiar. Now, nationalism is also a language ideology, nationalism may be a language ideology. You have other forms of nationalism as well, such as ethnic or racial nationalism or religious nationalism. But the idea that a nation possesses a unique language and that the language contains its unique essence is a very famous one, which certainly became widespread in the European world following Herder's famous binding of language with the nationhood of a people. Though even by that time, the late 18th century, Herder is demarcating it as the language that a nation should use. He's all too aware, and he feels, in fact, that the German language is being threatened by French. Language also bears with it a certain charge of symbolic power. And this is an idea, of course, that I derive from Bourdieu. And he writes that it is in the process of state formation that the conditions are created for the constitution of a linguistic market, one dominated by the official language. And the state language becomes a theoretical norm against which other linguistic practices are objectively measured. And there is here, of course, he's speaking of standard French or high French, the French of Paris and the elite, vis-a-vis what is negatively called the patois, regional languages, and so on. Here's some very interesting elements in this. And Kathy, I should actually, if I may interrupt, break my own talk at this point, please alert me when I have approximately 10 minutes left, and I shall try and speed up, because I have my phone here, so I can myself verify this. Okay, so
I'll try to remember.
No, that's fine. Yes, please alert me if in the full flush of discourse I kind of forget this. And by the way, to the audience, this is, I'm sticking very closely to the PowerPoints, which is not usually how I lecture, but I'm doing it because I have a great deal of ground to cover and I don't want to ramble on forever and ever, which people my age are quite prone to do.
Okay. Now that you've interrupted your talk for a moment, I
Yes.
realized that I forgot to mention, or even get your permission, the talk is being recorded.
Yes.
And I just want to confirm that that's okay with you.
Yes, thank you, Kathy. Yeah, I have no objection to recording. It's also, in fact, Zoom itself alerts one that recording is on and seeks permission to do it.
Yeah, okay.
Well, thank you.
Okay.
All right, so that was the first part in which I tried to lay out some of the other disciplines which I'm going to draw upon and which I think are important for the historical study of language. The part 2 is state processes, is a kind of deeper dive into state processes and language development. So here we have imperial processes, the pragmatics of language choice, of script use, and these result in archive formation and the scribal control of chanceries. Now, when I say archive formation, I think I should define an archive is a large body of records. It's not like the collected works of X great thinker which happen to repose on your bookshelf. So archives are large accumulations of records of past taxes, of censuses, of all kinds of information relevant to the working of the state. So the formation of an archive is often a result of state functioning, and the creation of an archive within a particular set of languages or particular language and particular scribal and recording conventions solidifies the control over it and the permanence of the position of the scribes who use it. So it's actually an important social process working through language and script. Now, drawing now from Bourdieu, whom I cited a little earlier, empires shape taste and deeply change language. So Eurasian empires, this is something I think that I don't need to emphasize to this audience. They shaped taste, they modeled style, and they molded consumption. And they reached far across speech communities. And they had, therefore, to sustain patterns of ordering reporting across diverse linguistic zones. In such a setting, you have ideological and pragmatic impulses that would compete. Modern nationalist mentalities tend to see the imposition of their own, quote, ethnic language as the only authentic choice. This is, I think, a modern attribution to earlier empires, though it was sometimes true, but not always. For administrative purposes, obviously, imperial establishments would try to see this, would try to use a standard language and communicate across different offices. And these offices were where the great mass of steady clerical jobs endowed with arbitrary power, delegated obviously by the ruling elite, regular fees, and quite probably regular kickbacks and bribes was to be found. And so the early Achaemenid emperors, the first great empire, the first great Iron Age empire of the Iranian world, developed a cuneiform script to write Persian, but used Aramaic, a Semitic language, as a government language. They were then conquered by the recently Hellenized Macedonians, who took to Attic Greek, the Attic register of Greek, Greek of Athens, with all the zeal of the Parvenu, and developed a Koine, or common language, out of it. And Koine Greek, in fact, was widespread across the Eastern Mediterranean world and beyond for many centuries. The first Persian emperors, the Achaemenids, before the Greek or the Macedonian conquests, were quite comfortable with using a foreign scribal language. This is actually, I realize I could have deleted this slide, but this is just a repetition of what I was previously said. And official texts were in a standardized form of Aramaic, a bureaucratic Aramaic, rather than any ancestral Iranian tongue. After the Greek conquest by Alexander and the incorporation of the Eastern Iranian world into the successor empire of Seleucus Nicator, a command Greek, what has been called command Greek, which is the sort of nascent pidgin spoken within the actually quite diverse military forces, was spoken in garrison cities and settlements of military veterans as far east as modern Afghanistan, if not further east. Slaves, workers, craft workers, persons from the displaced elite seeking a place in the new Hellenic empires soon learned variants of garrison Greek, and this became a Koine. Not all empires of this period were impelled to impose an imperial language. When the Mauryas annexed the eastern provinces of the Seleucid Empire, Ashoka had his edicts written in Greek in those parts for those who read no other tongues, and he also had them recorded in Aramaic for the benefit of the residual Achaemenid literati. For example, the inscription near Kandahar in modern Afghanistan is an example. Okay, post-Hellenic scripts become increasingly cursive and specialized, and this has a function, a sociological function, as Bourdieu and a number of other sociologists have indicated, most famously John Gumpertz for people who worked on South Asia, but also Ferguson for the Arab world. And the Guild of Bureaucrats did not wish to lay their records open to all comers, even if their spoken Middle Iranian language was comprehensible to at least the people around the Sassanid court. So, and the writing creates this possibility of regulating access. And the capacity to write Persian in Aramaic was an uncommon skill, one needing at minimum several years of study, and it can be seen as a part of the set of specialized skills and languages owned by these groups, and therefore creating their power. So Aramaic was in fact revived under the post-Hellenic empires, the Parthians and the Sasanians. But the scribes continued to write in the Arabic language, even if they were conveying a Persian meaning. If the scribe wrote the Aramaic word for bread, for example, it was to be pronounced as the Persian naan. And these terms are now called heterograms or Aramaeograms when specifically drawn from Aramaic. Now, here, of course, I'm going beyond my source, which is Scervo's outstanding work in this particular field, to argue that the great advantage of this is that the scribe could speak to the nobility and important officials and governors and so forth of the Parthian or Sasanian court, but their records could only be interpreted by them or by those whom they had initiated into this guild. So it created both an archive and a specialist class of its custodians who perpetuated themselves. At this time, therefore, and here I'm drawing from the work of Kevin Van Bladel, language was often used, language and script were often used for exclusion and not for inclusion. The spread of languages, and in his case, he's studying the spread of Arabic across what is today the Arabic-speaking world and the eastern parts, the western parts of the former Iranian world, cannot be explained by scholars and translations. An empire is an apparatus for the solidification of inequality, not for cultural uplift. And I quote Kevin Van Bladel here. No greengrocers, cobblers, or farmers abandoned their language and adopted Arabic because the works of Galen and Aristotle were translated into Arabic. Nor did their employers or owners urge them to adopt Arabic because they're of an interest in inducing them to participate in a prestigious literary culture. So the point of this is that there was no substitute. As long as the system of scripts and records and archives existed, there was no substitute for personalized expertise, even in the early colonial period. And there's some really wonderful work by Prachi Deshpande, whom you all may know, no, not all, but many of you may know, who is now at the Center for Studies in Social Sciences in Kolkata. And Prachi has pointed out that in the Peshwa Daftar, even the British colonial regimes, the Peshwa Daftar, sorry, is the great archive of Marathi and Marathi-related records, which has accumulated largely in the city of Pune, and which the British took over more intact and enlarged at the beginning of their rule. But repeated efforts to catalog these thousands and thousands of papers were nevertheless persistently dependent on a walking index, the native Karkun clerk, whose navigational skills and memory about the sheer mass of bundles were impossible to reproduce into usable and reliable paper catalogs. And this, I can attest, is still sometimes the case. There were 24 volumes of transcripts compiled by Farasnis, Dattatreya Farasnis in the early 20th century, which nobody in the Peshwa Daftar now can find, even though I myself read them in the 1990s. And so I know that they exist. I can even visualize what they look like. But it's my word against the archivists, and the archivists say they don't know or they have never existed. Now, Following the Arab conquest, returning to the story of Persian, following the Arab conquest and the decline of decline of the Caliphate, Iran was periodically shattered, the Iranian world, let's say, by tsunamis of pastoral peoples from Inner Asia, culminating with the Mongols. Now, I argue that these continual disruptions forced a simplification of scripts and the development of a common spoken and written language by literati who had to move more frequently in search of both safety and employment. So they needed a portable and transmissible language which was widely understood by people in search of needing their specific skills, which is to say nascent sultanates, kingdoms, or other sort of small states. The new Persian emerged, I would argue, in this context. And the Ghurid conquest of North India, 1192 to 1204, approximately speaking, came just before the first invasions of the Iranian world by Genghis Khan, which, conclusively sort of shattered shattered all the kingdoms actually east of the Seljuk, the Mamluk Sultanate of Egypt, and west of the Sultanate of Delhi, which was threatened, as historians of medieval India well know, for more than a century. The new conquest states in North India needed both scribes and soldiers, and the refugees supplied both. Religious and ethnic aliens in a new country, they were more trustworthy than the remains of the older scribal classes associated with just conquered kingdoms. So there's a kind of both a push and a pull factor, if you like, to think in terms of the classic sociology of migration. Great households of Turco-Persianate origin, as again already previously mentioned, would contain a large number of slaves and servants of diverse but largely Indic origins. And the default linguistic state in such a milieu would be a Persianate Hindavi. Hindavi is older but common usage for the languages of North India generally. And this would have a greater or lesser admixture of Persian and Arabic lexifiers, vocabulary items, depending on gender and rank of the speaker. And this was, I would argue, initially a Zanana, courtyard, and bazaar tongue, and it would be an emerging Creole. With the disintegration of the Delhi Sultanate after the destruction of its headquarters by Timur's invasion in 1398, and the formation of a number of regional kingdoms, you get a re-establishment of centralized empire in North India and gradually across much of Central and South India. And this, of course, is the Mughals. Now, the first Mughal empire was, as you again probably know, is short-lived, established by Babur in 1526, collapsed by 1540 when Humayun and his core following had to flee to the protection of Iran, of the kingdom of the Shah of Persia. And Humayun then reconquered Delhi with Persian help, with a new entourage of Persians to balance a core of older Turkic followers. Babur, of course, was of Turkic origin, though he was fluent in a number of languages. Persian, therefore, returned with Humayun as once again a dominant language of what it is at this point a nascent subcontinental empire. The Persian-speaking personnel who accompanied Babur formed the basis of Akbar's Humayun's son Akbar's reorganization of upper-level administration as he broke free from the tutelage of Babur's old retinue and their overbearing demands to a share in the new empire. Particularly with Akbar, Persian became the major language at the court and in important provincial centers. The Ain-e-Akbari, which is to some extent, obviously a kind of, it's more prescriptive than a descriptive text, but nonetheless, I think it accurately enough reports that his empire, Akbar's empire in the 12 provinces comprised of 107 major districts with over 2,737 Qasba centers, which essentially are the governing sites of what becomes known across certainly northern and central India as the Pargana, the cluster of villages. But even around the court, the common intermediary language would be an emergent Creole. And the scholar Badauni, who lived under Akbar and Jahangir, attests to this. For example, his translation, initial translation of the Mahabharata, was the Sanskrit was explained to him in Hindavi by a Sanskrit knowing Pandit, and he then translated, extempore translated the Hindavi into Persian, and that's how the text was generated. Sometimes you might have more, in fact, more complex chains of translation. Now, it's one of those sort of factoids which has kind of got into much of the historical discussion of language changes in the Mughal South Asia, is that village records were also Persianized this time. There is actually strong circumstantial evidence that this was never achieved, and that the village records remained in local languages regardless of Akbar's edicts. There is even later evidence. If Akbar is supposed to have made this transition in the 1580s and Todarmal is supposed to have enforced it, even in 1767-68, just after British rule is established in Eastern India, the Nawabi administration of Bengal, which was obviously present-day Bengal and Bangladesh, was essentially intact. Whole accounts of entire districts, which would be 4 or 5 of the modern district, were written entirely in what the English call the Bengal language, which was then translated into Persian, which was then translated into English. And the British found that the Bengal language was quite impenetrable to them at this point, and its script, conventions, and so on. But furthermore, even their Persian knowledge was quite limited. And in 1767, for example, the Bengal Council, which is essentially the cabinet, the central administration of British India as it then existed, had only one dependable Persian translator, and they could not in 1767 send the complete set of what they call country correspondence because the translator had been ill. So clearly, they begin to realize that they need to acquire more languages, and particularly, in their view, they need to acquire Persian. Okay, so this section now transitions to East India Company Persian and the colonial rationale for adopting it and sustaining it, and then it moves on to the rise of printing, and which then created a space for vernaculars like Urdu, Bengali, modern Bengali, Marathi, etc. Okay, the first thing is, why did the East India Company preserve Persian? In part, of course, because again, I should not assume that everybody knows, but anyway, they grew up within the framework of the Mughal Empire. Their grants, their sort of early tenure depended upon the farmans, which they often spell farmand, of the Mughal emperor. And they corresponded with him in that language and so on. But more than that, it was that the kind of the imperial ideology embodied in the Persian records was actually very palatable to the early British in Eastern India. And this is illustrated by the case of James Grant's report on the revenues of Bengal. Or in fact, later on, he wrote another one on the revenue of the northern Sarkars, which is today's coastal Andhra. And his argument on the basis of these was that the East India Company was being gulled and cheated by its Persianate servants, its Persian writing and reading servants, and that in fact, it should be getting at least 2 or 3 times as much tax revenue out of Bengal and Bihar as it believed, as it was in fact gaining. This is fictitious, and anyway, I won't labor that. I have written an article in the Journal of the Economic and Social History of the Orient in 2015, developing this argument at greater length. But it was, as I said, extremely palatable because the East India Company actually found that its net collections and its surpluses from Bengal were very small or non-existent. It was in deficit much of the time. In 1771, it had to plead for a grant from the royal treasury to keep it from bankruptcy. James Grant and other Persian reading scholars, or at least people who had good Persian munshis. I don't know how much of the James Grant's records were read by him and how much were by anonymous translators, offered Persian as a master key to the treasure chest that the early company so ardently sought to unlock. And even his critics did not controvert the argument that authentic knowledge of Indian revenue resources could only be found in Persian records. And it is this that causes English officials in late 18th and early 19th century British India to start studying the language and trying to find and read sources for themselves. And this is just an, one of those sort of little images. It's Sir William Jones, who was a judge in the High Court in Calcutta, but began to study Persian and was, of course, the person who first propounded, or at least propounded the hypothesis of the connection between Latin, Greek, and Persian and Sanskrit. William Jones, this is a draft of his efforts at translating the Siyar al-Mudakharin, which is a text which was in fact written for the benefit of the English East India Company. But apart from this desire to unlock the Persian archives, the British were also marked by a particular racial contempt for their Indian subordinates, or their Asian subordinates, so in general, sort of people not like them. And this meant that actual Persian study might not actually progress very far. So Charles Stewart, who was an army officer, consequently less well paid than the civil servants of the heaven-born service, the covenanted service of what later became the ICS, remarked that there was a strong prejudice in young men against the tuition of a native of India. Native had by this time already become racially marked, as you might possibly know. And so only a few people actually derived any benefit. But the idea that the cultivation of Persian was valuable in one's career was illustrated by Charles Stewart, by John Briggs, and by whole generations of officials. The company soon began to attract members of the older trained scribe of the Persianate scribal classes who wanted to naturally impress the new reigning elite on the value of their skills. Okay, that's a necessary part of marketing. And whenever we go to the, Kathy, am I running short on time?
Well, you asked me to let you know,
Yeah,
so I'm just letting you know that,
okay.
You don't have to, like 5 minutes or something like that.
Certainly. Well, I think I'm going to take a little longer than 5, but I will move through it briskly. Okay, so what you get is often British officials surrounded by a single British official surrounded by a bevy of Persian writing and reading men who essentially tell him what he should be finding or deciding. You get this even more starkly illustrated. These are illustrations from F.J. Atkinson, by the way, Curry and Rice on 40 Plates, which Frances Pritchett has very generously put on her Columbia website. But here's our joint magistrate. And you'll notice that he's actually running the government. He's the joint magistrate, so presumably he may be running the government of a district or helping to run the government of a district. And essentially, here's somebody reading out a paper, here's somebody writing a paper, and the joint magistrate is reading the sporting newspaper with his riding whip and his dog by its side. And that, I think, is perhaps a closer representation of the way that British rule functioned in the Persianate sphere than has at least appeared graphically in other settings. Then, of course, there was this kind of extra allowances and better postings for people who learned native languages or Hindustani. And here you have a bibulous and reluctant student with the famous Munshi Bahar, and he features again in Atkinson. And essentially, Bahar's great skill was that he helped his students to cheat in their language exams. Briefly to summarize. However, from the 1820s, there was a disillusionment with Persian statistical knowledge. First of all, the British, when they actually began to apply Western survey techniques and methods, when their power enabled them to penetrate across fields and villages and to sustainably generate records for decades, they discovered that actually the Persian representations of lots of things were wrong. And that even in the heartland of Awadh, for example, village records were almost always in a special scribal script, Kaithi, one of which was little known to the Persianate or even the Urdu-speaking and educated literati. Furthermore, literacy was not the same as numeracy, and the revenue accounts and tax records depended on that. And I argue that the boys who were destined to manage the accounts of a village or an estate would be introduced to these privately, probably by family members. Persian study was an attainment for display. Fiscal records were controlled as family heirlooms. And Karen Leonard has demonstrated this for Hyderabad, where even the reforming minister, Salar Jung I, could not remove the hereditary daftartars. They had the key to records of debts, taxes, and other state matters. He could only bypass them and create his own alternate archive, largely staffed on the British model by an Urdu-speaking and writing service gentry drawn from North India. And this is a change that begins to happen in the later 19th century, and particularly after the death of Salar Jung. Then I have some statistical information and descriptive information from the early East India Company surveys of the state of education in North India and Punjab, which show that in fact, very little Persian was seriously studied and levels of accomplishment was small. Only 1,746 out of in a population of 1/5 of the students were able to read, write, and comprehend if the book be an easy one. And the remainder could at best only read, being unable to give any account of any author that they had not previously encountered. So this is, I think, an indication of the actual level of Persian study as it existed, even after some 60 or 70 years of the East India Company using Persian. Now, I'd like to clear away one misconception, which is that Persian was abolished at a stroke, as an official language was abolished at a stroke in 1837. Its actual retreat from administrative use was much slower. But I don't think I have time to go into the details of the different offices, the different phases, and the various languages used. As long as Persian was a prestige language, Urdu was looked down upon. And in fact, the promotion of Urdu and English was reported by Sir Syed Ahmad Khan, the famous, the founder of Aligarh and so on, as one of the grievances that afflicted what the translator calls the Mohammedans of North India. It's only after 1857 and the suppression of the Great Uprising, the abolition of the Mughal court, and the assumption of the direct rule of India by Queen Victoria, that Syed Ahmad realized that it was impossible to sustain the Persianate world that privileged him and his class, and that he needed to reestablish or to defend their place in the new dispensation. And furthermore, there were new opportunities for Urdu-knowing officials in British Punjab, in Hyderabad, and elsewhere. And within North India, they were being challenged from an unexpected direction by the Devanagari writing, literati, which is a sort of, I think, probably many of you will be familiar with that aspect. One of the indications of the limited extent of bureaucratic penetration of Persian is shown by the fact that we have no printed forms. Modern bureaucracy loves printed forms. Now, of course, there are Adobe PDFs, editable Adobe PDFs and the like. But here is an extract from the Manual of Revenue Accounts published by T.C. Hope in 1873. And it lays out the set of forms that every village accountant was expected to keep. This is the English version. It will be translated into Marathi, Gujarati, Kannada, Urdu, whatever language was relevant. But this is actually is an indication of the junction of literacy and language in a single script and single language, and in a bureaucratic setting where increasingly the only jobs for the literati were to be found. And the world of print, as Niall Green has said, was not the thinly spread networked geography of Persian as lingua franca. And language ideology was now being supplemented by a fiercely charged script ideology, the Devanagari Urdu script controversy in North India. Okay, Kathy, I am now coming to the end of my peroration, and I hope I'm not too much. So Tariq Rahman, who studied the decline of Persian in an article in 1999, correctly observed that its decline from its position of power and prestige during British rule is a good example of how closely connected languages and attitudes towards them can be with political power. I have argued that this was equally true of the rise of Persia. It came with conquest. Its cultural power waned with the power of its users and weakened alongside the bureaucratic grip of its literati. And with that, I'm bringing my talk to an end. I hope that I've made myself, or at least that the major steps of the argument have been clear. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much for this incredibly wide-ranging and yet also focused talk. So I think I will now open it up for questions. The mechanics of this, I think if you raise your hand on the mechanically raise your hand through, not mechanically, technologically raise your hand through Zoom, it will help me keep track of who is asking what when. So let's see, I've got to figure out how I can see things. Somehow chat is getting in the way. Okay. Yeah, so I'm not seeing them. Bill, are you seeing hands raised? Or Sumit, are you?
No, I'm not actually. So I think everyone is shell-shocked or
okay. Well,
or bored out of their minds and waiting to log off.
It's really fascinating. So let's see, yeah, so there is an under reactions, just so everybody, okay, we have Samyak Ghosh.
Yes.
Yeah, so go ahead. But before you go ahead, let me just say before you go ahead, so if people are having trouble finding it, on the bottom screen on the right, it says reactions. And if you click on that, you'll see at the bottom of that, the place to raise your hand. Okay, go ahead.
Hi, thank you, Professor Guha, for that breathtaking, presentation, particularly the scope. I was wondering about, the first thing that I was thinking is about the site, the two sites that you were talking about, the court and the office. And I was thinking about everything that falls in between, because one of the operational categories that, was throughout your talk was that of the Creole. And, as an example, you pointed towards a Persianate Hindavi that is laced with Persian, to put it that way. So one wonders that, that language would be most alive and kicking in all these places in between. And by that, I mean, the khankas, the mazars, the bazaars, or even the haram, where these languages would be most alive and kicking. So I was wondering, we didn't get to hear more about those spaces that fall in between the court and the office. The other question that I had was to kind of slightly, I think provocative in the sense that I was wondering, how is this project distinct or different from something that Francesca Orsini would call a multilingual history of, the, let's say, the early modern period, or even something before the early modern period. And I'm thinking particularly about her essay where she lays out a scheme for doing this, or doing multilingual histories, particularly looking at how these, these vernaculars are, or, they're looking at the shared world of Turkish, Persian, Hindi, or Hindavi, however we put it. So how would this project, which kind of sets out by saying that it is not philological, would be distinct from something that Orsini does, which my understanding of it is very much both philological and owing its debt to social history. So those are the two questions I had. Once again, thank you for your talk.
Thank you. Kathy, shall I answer?
Yes, please.
Okay. Thank you, Shamuk, for this. The places in between. Well, the thing is that, the places in between often don't leave much by the way of records, precisely because they don't, remember the records, by and large, are left by scribes. The records that we can access, they're left by scribes. So they often don't leave much by way of records. Occasionally you get, the table talk, there are anecdotes of a particularly important holy man or something like that. And that class of, but certainly I take it that the sort of common language, the emerging vernacular would be widely used in such places. And that is in fact how it would spread, because people would acquire it as a second or third language, as is still the case in South Asia and other parts of the world today. In fact, there are probably more people speaking English as a second language than ever speak it as a first language. So now the other part is Francesca Orsini's project. Well, I should hope that I'm not writing the same book as she is. So I think I will stop at that point, since I can see a few other questions coming up. Yes, Ward?
Thank you, Sumit. Working in Southeast Asia, I've seen that Arabic in Muslim Java and Pali in Buddhist Burma, these are languages that young people spend enormous amounts of time learning to recite, and nobody worries about whether or not they can understand what they're saying.
Yes.
So clearly language is a vehicle for the transmission of power that you can try to make use of, that you deploy, but you obviously are subordinate to that powerful language. In your talk, I heard you mostly talking about very practical uses of language. So for material purposes, with the possible exception of the point where Persian becomes a prestige language that you show off. So do I understand that there was this two really different kinds of language ideologies at play? So Sanskrit or maybe Arabic would be the prestige language that intelligibility is irrelevant. And then these other languages like Persian are actually, of material interest, and that's what's at play.
Thank you, Ward. I don't think that the two exclude each other, actually.
No,
but,
of course.
Yeah, but they, I wanted to bring back into comparative language study the dimension of political power and particularly of imperial power. So I've leaned towards emphasizing that. I do mention the use of languages as sacred tongues, which results, for example, in the careful monopoly of Latin within the church and then Latin within the bureaucracy. And of course, in early medieval Europe, the church and the bureaucracy are pretty much the same, as is evidenced by the semantic and linguistic overlap between cleric and clerk. So, but yeah, so basically, I think you're right that prestige language and the ability to reproduce these phonetically is actually important. And that has been historically an important element of Sanskrit language ideology. I was going to say you will remember, but neither you nor I were there at that time. When the gods and the devas and the danavas go to war, the danavas lose because they mispronounce the formula he, reo, he, reya, and say heleo, helava, which is obviously mocking the bad pronunciation of actually Prakrit speakers, probably. But so the accurate pronunciation of formulae and so on is something which I think the Indo-European world has long associated, but anyway, I'm sorry, I'm beginning to ramble, which I'm prone to do, but I hope that answers this. I'm not excluding this other dimension. I think it's very important, but for the purposes of this talk, I wanted to emphasize the pragmatic and the power relationships of languages, scripts, and their bearers, and the changes in them through about 2,500 years.
You seem to be able to see whose hands is raised, and I, for some reason, can't get the names up now. So you go ahead and call on the next person. Sorry.
I think there isn't a next person.
Well,
As I said,
perhaps not. Well, do we have other questions?
Oh, yes, Mr. Tirmizi. Mr. Tirmizi, you've raised your hand, Syed Tirmizi.
Okay.
Hello, we cannot hear you, unfortunately.
Can you hear me now? Hello?
Yeah, yes.
Oh, yes. I'm sorry, the image and the voice don't quite match, but
okay,
yes.
Yeah. Okay, so, like interesting, before I ask my question, you have been promoted, I was looking at the transcript. So instead of, in the transcript, instead of saying Professor Guha, it said Professor Google. So, that was interesting. Anyway, my question, yeah. So my question is relating to the sacred language. I'm trying to understand, like by sacred language, for instance, Arabic would be considered as a sacred language for the Quran.
Yes.
But what about Hindi? What about Urdu? They would not be considered a sacred language? That's my question. And again, with respect to language controversy, Hindi is a language of nationalism at one point of time, but Hindi also becomes sectarian when it is, it is in conflict with the Hindi-Urdu controversy.
Yes.
So that is there. So these are my two observations. I wanted you to comment on that.
Oh, well, thank you. Well, the kind of modern or recent period, which for me begins in the 1850s or earlier, has changed the whole configuration of language ideologies, the massive spread of printing, the necessity for choosing a language of print and of education changes the whole field of force, if you like, within which language competition operates. And the Hindi-Urdu controversy was, I would say, more a controversy around script choice than around linguistic choice. It's more a question of whether the expanding world of colonial schools post 1858 was the students were going to learn Devanagari script, or whether they were going to learn the Urdu script, modified Perso-Arabic script, or whether they were going to learn Kayathi, which is an option that is now forgotten, but was pragmatically possible. So these things were something that changed quite drastically with the rise, firstly, of a much closer, a much more deep-reaching and persistent imperial administration, which is that of the British High Victorian Empire, and also with the rise, at least, of nascent nationalisms. So ideologically, these things changed. Technically, I think a theological scholar would tell you that neither Hindi nor Urdu are sacred languages. However, they have been, I would say unfortunately, imbued with an ideological affiliation to particular religions. It's unfortunate. I think it is historically wrong. That is to say, factually speaking, it's wrong. But this is the situation as it emerged, through the 20th century. So that's more or less what I would observe on your observations. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Do we have other questions? Yeah, I'm just sort of thinking about that colonial education issue and the extent it seemed that, or when you were speaking, it wasn't quite clear to me what the cause of the declining competency in Persian, and whether it was related to the changing educational system or the British efforts to undermine local transmission of Persian.
Thank you. Okay. Yes, I think I rushed that portion a bit, or perhaps I didn't lay it out. See, the British were not actually interested in undermining the transmission of Persian. The transmission of Persian required a conscious and active expenditure of time and resources to be sustained. So the inertial moment, the angle of repose, to use a completely misapplied metaphor, but the angle of repose is that Persian disappears. That's, the British didn't actually consciously have to undermine it. They, English replaced it as a prestige language or a high language at one level. And secondly, for administrative purposes, the British quite soon found that if they needed reports and returns, like the form number 9 that I put up from from Hope's Manual of Revenue Accounts, if they wanted reports and returns punctually sent out by tens and thousands of poorly paid subordinates in hundreds of thousands of villages, then they needed to make those returns and reports standard and in a language that these village record keepers knew or could learn. So the adoption of vernaculars, the adoption of printing, the formation of a bureaucratic machinery, all of these go together.
I guess I was asking it though in the context of the educational institutions themselves and the sort of perhaps, or at least my understanding was an effort to undermine the madrasas that were teaching Persian within the context of a religious education, and replacing them with schools that they controlled, or retraining the teachers and that sort of thing.
I think the extent of the madrasa education was, in fact, as Ward just was very much more a kind of rote recitation of sacred texts, a greater or smaller amount as time went. It was not something that the British could effectively turn to their own administrative purposes. So that's. And the second thing is that they didn't particularly undermine the madrasas. They just stopped employing their students for any administrative purposes, and that was enough to have people stop going, or at least have people go to them as secondary institutions, but not as their prime place of study. So it wasn't, anyways. And the hereditary qazis were already becoming quite illiterate by the end of the 18th century or the 19th century. There's a very funny story about the qazi. John Briggs had summoned the hereditary qazi of Dhule in Khandesh district to come to his court, and the qazi duly came and pronounced fatwas on different issues. And then at one point, Briggs, who was a good scholar and translated Farishta, he did the first translation of Farishta into English. Briggs asked him for a written opinion, and then learned that the qazi could neither read nor write. He had clearly been educated in his own madrasa, but he could probably have recited, perhaps recited the entire Quran. One doesn't know, but he could neither read nor write. So I think the decay of scholarship was quite easy when support was permanent. You had an endowment for your madrasa or an inam or something, and neither the Marathas nor the British nor anybody else would interfere with it as long as you didn't behave in seditious or disloyal ways. I'm sorry, Akil has a question, I believe.
Yeah, I think, and yeah, Akil. You're on mute, Akil.
Thanks for that terrific talk, Sumit. I had a very broad question about what was the effect of these natural languages that you describe in governance and so on in these periods of empire. How does it relate to conceptual vocabularies? That is, how does natural language vocabulary of a language which was in the exercise of empire and governance and so on, how does it yield a kind of possible bias and so on in the conceptual vocabularies that, for instance, circulated in the law, and which people had to respond to, and different languages, different natural languages tend to yield specific concepts, conceptual vocabularies, because the lexicon and concepts are sort of go hand in hand, and the ideologies you describe will naturally carry over. And so I was wondering how much such a language of governance with its conceptual vocabularies had to be navigated with the conceptual vernaculars of the people who were, say, for instance, in a court being assessed and judged and so on. Do you want to say something about that?
Well, thank you. That is a very deep question, which, for more than a century since the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis was first formulated, that the relation between lexicon and semantics has been quite deeply studied, and I wouldn't set myself up as an expert on this. But I think the strong version that language limits the conceptual world of its users is now not maintained by the linguistics profession anymore. The other side is that, you see, there's a lot of access to official proceedings and records and so forth, even in an earlier period. There's a wonderful section description of this in Bhavani Raman's book on Kachari Tamil, or Kachari Tamil, as the English would say. But see, government offices, darbars, courtyards, all places where official business of some kind was conducted would be crowded with petitioners, beggars, hangers-on, curious people, and so forth. And officials often governed by circuits across the country. Even into the British period, officials were supposed to get out and tour. There was the whole touring, what they call the touring season, during which they did this. Consequently, there would be a lot of people exposed to scraps of administrative terminology, sometimes at second hand, in these settings. And they would pick up parts of the signification of these, they would certainly understand their own meaning. And I know that Ward is waiting for another question, but I'd like to end with I'd like to mention an anecdote from William Carey, who was one of the early pioneers of printing in Indian languages, of the study of Indian languages, and so on. Here's the story of this English judge who sentences a convicted criminal to death, and gives a long peroration as to how much he was suffering as a consequence of having to pronounce such a harsh sentence, but how the crimes of the prisoner were beyond all description in their atrocity, and how he should use the time remaining before his execution to repent sincerely and reconcile himself with his maker, and so on and so forth. After which, he tells the court translator to translate this into Hindustani for the benefit of the convict, who of course had not understood a word. So the translator wakes up, perhaps from a slight doze, and says, "Jao badzat, phansi ka hukum hua hai." Which I should translate is, "Go, you scoundrel, the sentence is death." And the judge is then, Carey says that the judge then expressed his admiration of the great compactness and perspicuity of the Hindustani language. Okay, well, that is, so, sorry, let's see, is Ward, would you like to come in and ask what it is that you had to say?
Yes, just very quickly. In the Dutch East Indies, the Dutch wanted very much to keep Dutch for themselves and only the very highest status aristocrats. Did the English feel that way in South Asia?
Yes, there's a wonderful passage in George Orwell's Burmese Days about a butler in the club who has learned to speak good English, and he's reprimanded for speaking in that way and told that in fact he should talk in a sort of kind of in a pidgin, which is the proper dialect for a person of his status. So it's there's some of this. There is also, however, the kind of evangelical aspect of the British. The Dutch, I will say but most of them ruled indirectly. They initially operate, and they continued to rule indirectly until at least the reform period of the later 19th century. The British had a more evangelical idea, and I forget, I think it's John Malcolm who says that the English believe that no nation can, just as Muslims believe that no one can be saved without their faith, English believe that no nation can be saved without their institutions. And that in fact, the indigenous institutions are quite good and should be continued. But anyway, that was a line that was not pursued. But the possession of a language as a particular marker of a ruling elite is, I think, it's a sort of language ideology that's quite deep, but it periodically clashes with the pragmatics of language use and of governance. So, one shouldn't think of a single impulse behind the ultimate outcome.
Okay, well, I think it's about time to wrap it up, unless we have any more urgent short questions. I want to thank you so much for this really engaging talk, and thank all of you who have joined us for the talk. I look forward to seeing you all in our subsequent colloquia over the course of the year. Thank you.